Okay, can you hear me? Marianne, can you hear me? Okay, because the microphones have been turned off because of the recording as usual. So you may have missed the beginning, but that's not very consequential.
The
I,
camera turned off also, Fabrizio.
okay, so we need to wait for them?
No, your camera. We don't see you.
Thank you so much.
Actually.
Okay, as usual, Teams has that new feature that whenever you start the recording, it shuts off the microphones and cameras of everyone. So it's always a bug more than a feature. So today we have two talks that are around the most popular theme of RAG, Retrieval-Augmented Generation, by three presenters. As you all know, that's a very popular topic because, well, LLMs have a nasty tendency of hallucinating when they're not guided properly. So retrieval of relevant documents to inform their generation is very important. First, we're going to have a talk by Parishad BehnamGhader from McGill University, who's going to present her research. And then we'll have a presentation by two presenters from the University of Montreal, Suyuchen Wang and Roth. I was going to say, make sure that you mute yourselves so that we can enjoy the presentation distraction-free, but I think that Teams has done it for you. Every talk is going to be followed by a 5 to 10 minute question and answer session. So you can write down your questions as you encounter them. And then at the end of the presentation, you're going to have time to ask the presenter. You can type questions in the chat, and they're going to be relayed to your presenter. And you can ask your questions in French if you want. They're going to be translated if it's necessary. So we're going to move on now to the first presentation by Parishad BehnamGhader from McGill University and also the MILA Institute, who's going to present retrieval-augmented generation from limitations to improvements. We thank Parishad BehnamGhader, who's very busy as a PhD student at McGill and MILA. She's advised by Professor Shiva at the McGill NLP group, and her research focus on the current topic and as well text representation. Parishad has earned her BSc and MSc degrees from Sharif University of Technology in Iran. So thank you so much, Parishad. If you wish, you can unmute your microphone, share your screen, and then the floor is going to be yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I hope you can hear me well. 1 second.
Perfect.
Okay, great. So my name is Parishad, and hi everyone. I'm super excited to be here talking about my two of my research projects. Today I'm going to talk about one of the limitations of retrieval-augmented generation systems, RAGs, and also talk about a paper that we had on improvements on these models. Basically text encoders that are also used in retrieval-augmented generation as well. Great. So we all know that recently big tech companies have been introducing their new LLMs, large language models, let's say Cohere, OpenAI, Mistral AI, and etc. And these models are all used in many NLP downstream tasks, such as question answering. They are used as agents and chatbots. They are used in drug discovery, medicine, in machine translation, coding, and many more other tasks. These models are all trained on huge amount of data. Let's say the data available on the internet. And the problem with this data set is that the LLM's training data can become out of date after some time. So in these cases, the LLMs will extrapolate when facts aren't available or are not seen as much during the pre-training, and they generate false but very plausible sounding responses that we call hallucination. So the responses seem natural, but they are incorrect. So one of the ways that we can mitigate this hallucination of these models these days is by retrieval-augmented generation. So in retrieval-augmented generation, what we have is a corpus of knowledge. It can be the web, it can be Wikipedia corpus, or it can be a corpus of books and articles, let's say. Then the retriever will retrieve some documents out of this huge amount of data. And then the language model will be generating the responses grounded to these documents. So using retrieval, the language model can adapt to new or more up-to-date information, although the data that had been pre-trained on was out of date. It can adapt to new tasks that they are, let's say, new or based on the user's needs or a company's needs and etc. And hopefully the model will hallucinate less often. So with more widespread use cases of these models, it is very important to access the correct responses, especially in some domains such as medical domains that the responses are very important and critical. It is also important to be aware of the limitations of these systems so that we know when and how to use these models in our use cases. And we should also look for methods for more accurate retrieval in the end. So the first paper that I want to talk about is entitled as Can Retriever-Augmented Language Models Reason? The Blame Game Between the Retriever and the Language Model. So we want to study if the retriever or the language model is responsible for the shortcomings of RAG systems in reasoning-intensive tasks. So what we know is that the retrievers are usually trained to maximize the similarity between the representations of a query and its corresponding correct document, and minimize the similarity of the representation of the query with other documents' representations. So this similarity here can be like a simple dot product of the representations or a cosine similarity of them, or sometimes model use a notion of distance metric between the representations, such as the L2 distance. So the question is this objective sufficient for retrieval-augmented language models or like RAG systems to perform well in these tasks? So to start this, what we did was to have some controlled experimental setup. So in this setting, what we have is that we have a query in a form of a fill-in-the-blank sentence or a question, such as Phobos should be classified as which type of body. And then for each of these queries, we have a set of knowledge statements. So these statements are at most 25 for each of these queries, and they are specific to those queries. What Retriever does is that it retrieves some of these knowledge statements based on the query, and then the language model will generate the answer based on the retrieved statements and the query itself. So for instance, the answer for this question or this masked sentence will be moon. The dataset that we used in this setup was Entailment Bank. So the statements in Entailment Bank dataset are specific to each test instance, as I said before. And for in order to answer the question correctly, multiple statements are required, and the information from multiple statements should be combined to get to a correct answer. So in this setup, we analyze different retrievers and generators. We study Realm and KNN-LM as the retrieval-augmented language models. So Realm, the QA version, for example, extracts the span out of the retrieved information. KNN-LM basically predicts the next token as an interpolation between the next token of a language model and a next token based on the memory that it has for the retrieval. DPR and Contriver are by encoder retrievers. And FID and Atlas are basically T5-based language models and generators. So there is a difference between T5 and their structure. The difference is that in FID and Atlas, the retrieved information like these are encoded by the T5 encoder first, and then the T5 decoder will basically decode the concatenated versions of these representations from the T5 encoder. And then in the end, we also evaluate FLAN T5 with retrieval. And the reason is that FLAN T5 is an instruction-tuned model, and it has a moderate size comparable to Realm, KNLM, FID, and Atlas, so that the model size doesn't change much in our experiments. Okay, so let's first talk about the retriever's shortcomings in reasoning-intensive tasks, such as entailment bank. So let's say we have a question, such as phobos should be classified as which type of body, the thing that we had before as well. And we have a set of 6 statements here. The first 3 are actually the ground truth ones, that if we have an ideal retriever, this retriever should retrieve these 3 first stop statements. But what happens in practice is that when we are using a normal retriever such as DPR, these are the retrieved statements when we retrieve only 3 statements from these 6. So what happens is only one of them is ground truth, is basically required for the reasoning and getting to the correct answer, but 2 of them are incorrect. To show this quantitatively, we also did some experiments that I'm going to show right now. So let's say we have an Oracle setup that for each of the questions, we know how many statements should be retrieved. So for some questions should be 4, 5, 7, 10, or for the example that I showed here, only 3 statements were required. So in this case, what happens is that Contriver, the best performing retriever out of the studied retrievers in our paper, Contriver performs at most around 47% accuracy, which means in each of the retrievals, more than 50% of the statements are retrieved incorrectly. So this shows that the simple similarity metric between the query and the documents is insufficient for retrieving all the necessary statements for reasoning. Again, this can be shown in this example. So here in this figure, instead of like having that Oracle knowledge that the number of required statements were known, here we increase the number of retrievals from 1 to 100. And see that again, even with retrieving 10 statements for each of the questions, knowing that the average number of required statements is less than 10 for the questions, the performance is not high again. So again, emphasizing the fact that the similarity metric is insufficient for our case. We can see the same in the examples taken from the data set. So let's say we can take a look at this Contriver plus Atlas reasoning. So the question is, what keeps the moon orbiting Earth? The first statement is retrieved correctly. Moons orbit planets. It is required. It is relevant to the question. But the second one, which is gravity causes orbits, is not retrieved by Contriver retriever. And that is why the model is in the end predicting an incorrect answer, because the retrieved statements weren't correct in the beginning. So this means that sometimes the statements that are required but not similar to the query itself are often left out. Okay. So now we know that retrievers are not perfect in retrieving the required statements. But what about language models? If we have an ideal retriever, like the one that we showed before, are language models able to reason over these statements? The answer is often no, sometimes yes. So as you can see here in this case, FID and FLAN T5 can generate the correct answer, although the other 3 are are not capable of doing that in this simple example. So to show that, we did this experiment. So we assume that we have an ideal retriever, basically giving only the ground truth and correct statements as the input to the language model. So here we can give only 2 correct statements, and here we will give only 5 ground truth statements. So as you can see, the performance of ReLM and KNNLM is very, very poorly here. As you can see, as we increase the number of retrieved statements, the performance is not changing much. And I will get back to this later. But the more recent models, such as FLAN-T5, can perform promisingly, maybe. They can reason as we increase the number of statements, and that's very good. But what happens is that even FLAN-T5 is performing at most around 45% token overlap F1 score. So again, this is not much, but what happens is that we also went through seeing how the best performance of these models on this task is. So in order to do that, we did another experiment, which is shown with the dotted lines here. So we, instead of giving the knowledge statements separately and ask the model to reason over them, we just give one single statement as the oracle statement to the model. So here, let's say for the question, like Phobos should be classified as which type of body, we give the single statement as Phobos is a kind of moon. These single statements are basically derived from a combination of the knowledge statements, and they are available in the dataset itself. So what happens is the model should answer to this question using only this single statement. And this is basically the upper bound for the performance of these models in our setup. So as you can see, the ReLM and FID and Atlas performance at most is around 60, and FLAN-T5 is a bit less. And I will explain this in a little bit. So again, what is important to me at least is that the gap here between FLAN-T5's performance, between the upper bound and the reasoning, is not that much in the more recent language models. Although in like the ReLM and KNNLM, for example, this gap is very huge. So in order to show some examples of these failures of the language models, first you can take a look at the FLAN-T5 performance. So the question is, what allows 2 students standing 10 feet apart to hear each other talk? And the correct answer should be the vibrating air or air vibration or something like that. But the prediction is basically a microphone, which is not given in the statements. So one of the reasons that FLAN-T5 is not performing well, even in the single statement setup, is that it sometimes generates responses regardless of the given information in the prompt. Another problem with ReLM that was also obvious here, that even with increasing the statements, the performance was still almost the same, is that the model ReLM it tends to take the answer or extract the answer span from the first few retrieved statements. Although when it comes to reasoning, what we care about is basically combining information and not only just extracting the information from the first statement only. So here in this example, the answer is the prediction actually is taken from the first retrieved statement, although the correct answer is winter from the second one. But anyways, so now we know that language models are not performing perfectly on reasoning tasks, but they are kind of doing the reasoning in some cases. So what happens when we combine retrievers with combine language models with imperfect retrievers? Then what happens is that they are performing even worse when combined with imperfect retrievers. And you can see this in this figure. So comparing the same colors between the solid lines and the dotted lines shows the gap when we go from ideal retriever to an imperfect retriever that retrieves distracting information as well as the ground truth information. So as you can see, let's say for FLAN T5 here, when retrieving 5 statements, the performance drops around 30%, which is pretty huge. So as a conclusion, we showed that simple query document similarity metric of retrievers is not sufficient for retrieving essential and required statements for reasoning. Language models, on the other hand, cannot reason perfectly over Oracle statements. And Oracle statements means like having a single statement or even having an ideal retriever. And everything becomes worse when language models are combined with imperfect retrievers, which is actually what happens in a real world scenario because we don't have access to perfect retrievers. So as I said before, recent models are shown to perform better in reasoning, like FLAN T5, but the huge gap between the gold and all performance, between the solid and dotted line performance here, stems from the retriever's weak performance. So maybe it is time to have some stronger text encoders and text retrievers. So now we go forward to I go forward to the next paper, LLM2VEC, that we show that large language models are secretly powerful text encoders. So to start, I talk about text representation and universal text representation. So traditionally, what happened in text representation and text encoding was that distinct encoders were fine-tuned for different encoding tasks. Let's say when we had clustering tasks, we had a clustering encoder that would basically represent the inputs in a vector space, and then a clustering method here would just cluster these representations into two categories, for example. When we had retrieval, we had a retriever as like maybe by encoder retriever to encode the documents and the queries into different spaces and then do the retrieval in the end. When it came to classification, we had, again, different encoders that could encode the input sentences, and then using a single layer, maybe classifier, we could just classify the sentence, let's say the Amazon review, into positive and negative. So these text embedding tasks could be classified and also can still be classified into two categories of asymmetric and symmetric. So in asymmetric tasks, such as retrieval and re-ranking, the distribution of two parts of the task are basically different. So when it comes to retrieval, we have queries and we have documents. Queries are usually short sentence questions or like a set of tokens that seek for information, and on the other hand, the documents are longer sequences of tokens with some information in hand. But the other category, symmetric tasks, are like classification and clustering, when all the pairs of the items in this task are from the same let's say same distribution. For example, all of the sequences are such Amazon reviews, for example. So later on, instead of text representation, what happens is that these days universal text representation is very popular among the tasks. So what happens in this task is that instead of having different encoders for different tasks, we have a single embedder here in gray, and then given an input X, we will represent this input X, based on different users' needs. So for example, here in purple, we have find duplicate questions for input X. In green, we have retrieve documents from Wikipedia for input X. And again, in red, we have classified the question's topic and then input X. So basically, a single encoder is going to represent the input based on the user's needs that is indicated in instructions in the prompt. So in order to evaluate language models or text encoders on these tasks, we use MTEB, Massive Text Embedding Benchmark, that consists of many data sets from clustering and classification to retrieval and re-ranking, basically both of the categories that I mentioned before. So what we want to explore in this project is that can LLMs be used as universal text encoders or not? So we know that LLMs perform very strongly on many downstream NLP tasks. There are a lot of these models available out there that we can use for fine-tuning, such as MetaLlama or Mistral. And we also know that LLMs are pre-trained for instruction following as well. So they perform very good given the instructions, and that is basically one of the base things in universal text representation. So the question is, can we benefit from the LLM's strong power for universal text representation? In LLM2Vec, which is a simple unsupervised method that can convert any decoder-only transformer-based large language model to text encoder, we show that yes, that is possible. So LLM2Vec includes 3 simple steps. First, enabling the bidirectional attention connections. Second, performing masked next token prediction to adapt the model to the bidirectional attentions. And third, and finally, performing an unsupervised contrastive learning for better sentence representation. So I will go through each of these steps and show the impact of each of these steps on MTEB benchmark. So the first step was enabling bidirectional attention. So what happens in decoder-only large language models is that all the attention connections are causal. So basically, the representation of each token here will be affected by the representation of that token from previous layer and all the tokens before. But what we suggest in this work is to enable all the bidirectional connections. So basically, the token representation can be affected by previous tokens and later tokens as well. But these bidirectional attention connections are out of distribution setting for most of the language models because these decoder-only language models have only seen causal attentions and not the bidirectional connections. So these bars show the performance of simple decoder-only large language models, Mistral and Llama 2 in these examples, on a subset of MTEB benchmark. So each of these sections, EOS mean and weighted mean, show how we pull the sentence representations out of the token representations that the language model provides us. So in end of sentence, what happens is that we append the end of sentence token to the end of the sentences and pull that token's representation. In mean, we simply just average the token representations of the last layer. And in weighted mean, we do a weighted averaging over these representations so that the later tokens have higher scores and weights in the weighted averaging. So what happens after enabling the bidirectional connections is that, as we expected, the performance drops in some of the cases because these bidirectional connections are out of distribution and not seen during pre-training of these models. But interestingly, it turns out that this bidirectional connection actually helps some of the models, such as Mistral, out of the box without any fine-tuning. So as you can see here in Mistral, the green bars are higher than the red ones in all cases. But why that happens? So we did a small analysis on this. As you can see, here the x-axis is the token position in the paragraph, so from 0 to 200, and the y-axis basically shows the cosine similarity of the token representation before and after enabling the bidirectional connections. So here, and also the colors show the number of the layer in the transformer model. So when it comes to yellow, in both llama model, llama 2 and shared llama model, as you can see, the cosine similarity after enabling the bidirectional connections is pretty low, around 25% here and around 0.5, sorry, not percent, 0.5 and 0.25 in llama and shared llama models. And that is not the case for Mistral. So in Mistral, in all the layers from layer 0 to layer 32, the cosine similarity is around 1, which means that the representation of the tokens are not changing after enabling the bidirectional connection. And that is why maybe that the model is not hurting from enabling the bidirectional connections here. Okay, so now we have a model that has that is not causal and has both forward and backward connections in the architecture. So what we can do is to basically do something like mass language modeling in BERT model in our large language models. So what we want to do is to learn to predict the masked tokens in these masked inputs. But instead of doing the masked language modeling thing, that we could use this representation of the masked token to predict the masked token W3 here. Instead, what we do is that we take the representation from the previous token and predict W3 instead. So the reason to do that is to bridge the gap between the masked language modeling pre-training in BERT and the next token prediction pre-training in large language models. So here, when we fine-tune the LLM2-vec models with MNTP, we see an improvement compared to the green bars in MTB scores. And interestingly, enabling these bidirectional attentions and also doing the MNTP shows to improve the performance of these models in word-level representation tasks as well, such as part-of-speech tagging or named entity recognition. So as you can see, the yellow bars are higher than the black lines that are the unidirectional decoder-only models performance, and for sure higher than just enabling the bidirectional attentions, which is the green bars. Going back to the sentence representation tasks, for now, what we have is a model with bidirectional connections and then trained to do token representation as well. But what we cared about from the beginning was to do sentence representation instead of token representation. So in order to do that and keep the paradigm unsupervised, we did unsupervised contrastive learning, and we took SimCSE for this task. So basically, we adapt the model to sentence representation task. For contrastive learning, what we usually use and need to do is to have a positive pairs for each of the items. So negatives are basically optional. We can have hard negatives or not in retrieval, but positive pairs should be existing in the dataset. So in order to find the positive samples in an unsupervised dataset, what SimCSE does is that they basically give the input sentence twice to the model and use the model's dropout to generate different samples of that item. And then this means that we will have positive pairs for each of the items in the dataset. After applying SimCSE to our model, we will see a huge improvement on MTB scores, and this shows that an unsupervised sentence representation fine-tuning is helping our model very much in performing better on MTB dataset. So just to see, because these figures were on a subset of MTB scores, just to have a sense of how the models perform on the whole MTB dataset, You can see that again, LLM2Vec is performing very well compared to the baselines that are BERT and BERT plus SimCSE, and also other baselines that are unsupervised on MTB leaderboard. And this also is like the average score of MTB is also reflected on the retrieval subtasks of this benchmark. So again, LLM2Vec is performing on 38, which is pretty well compared to other models. But what happens in these days papers is that what if we just fine-tune our model with supervised data? So until now, we showed that unsupervised fine-tuning is helping very much our models in performing better on MTB benchmark. But what about using some supervised data? So what we did in this section was to further fine-tune our model with 1.5 million samples that are supervised and labeled. So these samples are taken from another paper and are combination of other datasets such as HotBot-QA, Fever, Miracle, MS Marco, and more. And all of these datasets are accompanied with an assigned instruction so that the universal text representation still holds. And these are the results of our supervised models on MTB benchmark. So as you can see, our models are performing better than other competitors in the leaderboard that are trained only with publicly available data. So other models with more private data are performing better for sure. But compared to these models, our models are performing very well. And an interesting thing here is that for sure supervised data is helping compared to the unsupervised results. But what is very interesting is that when it comes to supervised fine-tuning, it seems like the SimCSE unsupervised fine-tuning is not necessary anymore, because as you can see, the difference between the LLM2Vec without SimCSE and the LLM2Vec original, which is with SimCSE, is not much. And that also holds on retrieval. So basically, in all the cases, the results are pretty the same. Which means that the model learns the pattern for sentence representation with supervised data, and no unsupervised training is required in these cases. So as a conclusion, we showed that simple LLM2Vec recipe leads to strong text encoders with minimal changes to language models. And also this minimal change includes minimal training. So all those MNTP and SimCSE steps take only, let's say, a few hours of training on large language models, let's say 7 billion models. So they are pretty lightweight, and they can be done with a few number of data sets and data samples. And also we show that LLMs are inherently strong embedders. The only thing is that we have to unlock this power to show how these models can perform well on the text representations task. And yeah, I suggest you to take a look at our GitHub and paper, and take a look at our checkpoints on Hugging Face. And yeah, thank you so much. I will be happy to take any question.
Thank you so much, Parishad. Very interesting. So we have a few minutes for questions. As usual, you can ask your questions in English or French. You can type them in the chat, or you can simply speak up. Just remember to unmute yourself. So do we have any questions for our presenter today?
Yeah, I will start. Very interesting talk. Thank you. I think you noticed very correctly that there are different tasks. So one is a symmetric task, and another one is a symmetric one. Have you observed whether your modification or your work, your modified attention has a different impact on those tasks in the data set?
Mm-hmm. So we didn't take a look, like a deep look into that, But what we saw was that, so for instance, what happens is that in word level tasks, the like bidirectional attention and MNTP has a higher impact because like the MNTP is basically doing helping the model to do the word level tasks. But on the sentence level tasks, comparing symmetric and asymmetric ones, we saw that, let's say, SimCSE helps more with symmetric tasks because although it is still helping with retrieval and other asymmetric tasks, but the helping is much more in symmetric tasks because when it comes to SimCSE, what happens is that again the pairs, the positive, like let's say the item and the positive corresponding item are from the same distribution. So let's say it's a Wikipedia sentence and then with passed to the model with two different dropouts. But when it comes to asymmetric, the query is something and then the positive pair, which is a document, is something else. So in these cases, it seems like SimCSE is helping more with symmetric tasks, but interestingly, it is still helping with asymmetric tasks as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question? Otherwise, I can ask another one. So you noticed there is a difference between Llama and Mistral. And you observed that they produce different results. But do you have explanation in addition to the layers similarity? Do you have some explanation relating to the training process in Llama and Mistral that explain this?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. So unfortunately, we don't have any 100% certain explanation for that because all we know from these models is just a technical report out of the companies, and they are like not thorough usually. But our guess, our hypothesis on this matter is that we think that maybe Mistral models are also like, as well as the next token prediction and all these things, they are trained with prefix LM as well. So in prefix LM, what happens is that the first part of the sentence has the bidirectional connections, let's say some instruction, and then the second part goes with the simple decoder only causal attention. So this is our hypothesis that we are not sure again, but we think that maybe Mistral model has gone through some kind of prefix LM training, and we also so we checked the code and everything, but we saw some functions that they could also get this argument as an input that being causal or not. So that's why we are like thinking more, we are more certain on the hypothesis that maybe prefix LM is done during Mistral pre-training. But yeah, as Llama and Shared Llama, both of them are not like doing this, especially on the higher layers. We think that that is the case with Mistral and not with the other models. Yeah, thank you for the very great question. Yeah.
Thank you, Parishad. We have a question from Samira Ibrahimi Kaouz. Samira, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you. You should unmute yourself, Samira. Oh, maybe there's a technical problem.
Yeah, maybe some kind of permission is required and they are doing that.
Oh, she says I cannot unmute. So
okay.
Unfortunately, it's a bit difficult. Maybe you can try, maybe there's a setting somewhere that says that you need to accept the recording being recorded, the recording being made to be able to unmute yourself.
Or you can type the question in the discussion board.
Yeah, sure.
Well, maybe in the meantime, Parishad, could you please show us the MTEB data set, please? Because that's one of your contributions. It's that big data set. Could you just explain a little bit further? Because you went a bit fast for me. So the task is you were evaluating the quality of the embeddings.
Yeah, just to make sure, this is not our contribution. So MTB is a well-known data set in like text embedding tasks, and I think soon another version of this benchmark will be out. So what happens in this benchmark is that they want to unify all the text embedding tasks from clustering and classification to more complicated like retrieval and re-ranking. So basically, this benchmark includes many smaller data sets that we all know, let's say natural questions or climate fever, the small data sets that they are pretty well known. So they have gathered all of them together. And then these are just some small data sets. Basically, in order to evaluate the model on this benchmark, what happens is that we should evaluate our model on each of these small data sets and then have a final average scoring over all the small evaluation metrics. So that is why in my experiments, what I show here are all so we have different categories in MTB: retrieval, re-ranking, clustering, pair classification, SDS, and summarization. The average score here is the average of all the subtasks, but we also show basically it's very well known to show the performance of the models in each of these subcategories as well, so that we can compare, let's say, if our model is better in retrieval compared to another model but is worse in clustering. So here the difference between symmetric and asymmetric tasks can be pretty clear, and the dataset includes many data. Yeah, the benchmark includes many smaller data sets over 8 categories. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. It's much more clear now. I'm sorry. I thought it was your contribution, but now that you explain it, I understand better.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry, I should have spent more time on this slide.
We're running a bit late, so what I'm going to do is ask Suyuchen to ask his question because he was the first one to raise his hand, and you'll have two questions in the chat for you, Parishad, that you could answer at a later time. I'm so sorry, but we need to keep the time. Suyuchen, it's up to you.
Okay, thank you for your interesting talk, and I've already seen some of my lab mates already using your models. And I have a question about the training objective. So you mentioned that you use mass next token prediction. And I have basically two sub-questions. The first one is that why you use this objective instead of the original mass language modeling objective. And secondly is that if you use mass next token prediction, how do you do the word level or token level classification task? Because essentially here, W2 predicts W3. So it feels like the representation corresponding to W2's position is actually representing W3. So which tokens representation are you using? Thank you.
That's thanks for the questions. So yeah, I will try to explain this here, but if it wasn't thorough, or we can chat later. But I also suggest you taking a look at one of the appendices in the paper, because I'm like explaining that very clearly in that appendix. But for now, so why we did MNTP was that, to be honest, we did MLM as well. And that is why we stick to MNTP in the end, because it seems like the models are pre-trained to do next token prediction during the pre-training, because they are decoder-only models, right? So these LLMs, each of the tokens representation is going to be used to predict the next token. And now what we want to do is to just mask one of the tokens in the sentence and ask the model to predict this mask token. So we could either go using what happened in the traditional MLM, using the same tokens representation, or basically adapting to the next token prediction pre-training phase of these models and use the previous tokens representation. So this previous token representation seems to be working better than using that token because the model has gone through a very long phase of pre-training, and then it has basically trained to look at the previous token to generate the next token. And now if we want to mess up with this, it will perform a bit poorly. So that is a very short explanation for the first question. And the next one for word level tasks, that is a very valid question. And what happens is that exactly as what we did for mask next token prediction, again, for word level tasks, we are using the previous tokens representation for the next token category. Let's say if we want to check the part of speech tag of the second token, we take the representation of the first token and classify this representation for POS tagging. And for words that have multiple tokens, again, we take, basically we are shifting all the tokens to the left and taking the representations of those. So in the paper, I have some examples in the appendix, like with W1 to WN and showing this. But yeah, let's talk like offline maybe, if you have more detailed questions on this, but that's a very good question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think it solved my question.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parishad. So you have a lot of interest. So thank you so much for taking the time to present this to us this afternoon. As I said, there are 2 questions in the chat that you may want to look at. So I think that we're going to move on now from to the presentation of Suyuchen and Kyle. So Suyuchen and Kyle will present their work at the Université de Montréal, our university, on a topic called Adapting RAG when relevant facts are dispersed. So as I said, Suyuchen, Wang, and Kyle Roth are PhD students at the DIRO, the Département d'Informatique et de Recherche Opérationnelle at the Université de Montréal. They're supervised by Professor Bang Liu. So this means that they're members of MILA and my lab as well, Rally. Suyuchen's research focuses on long-term, long context LLMs, multimodal large language models, and RAG agents. So he obtained his BNG in computer science from Behnam University, while Kyle Roth has a BSc in applied and computational mathematics from Brigham Young University in the United States, and his research is on structured use of LLMs within larger pipelines and agent systems. So I don't know how you want to proceed, Suyuchen. Would you like to go first, or would Kyle want to start?
Yeah, so I'll go first, and then I'll move on to Kyle.
Great, thank you so much. So you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I think Perfect. You can see my screen. All right, thanks for the introduction. And I'm very glad to present our work. So my work first, and then Kyle's work. And this work is called FACT, Examining the Effectiveness of Iterative Context Rewriting for Multi-Fact Retrieval. And this is a collaboration with our lab and MetaGPT. And it's submitted to ARR as a short paper. And the reason why it's a short paper, because it's a work in progress. So we are just introducing our intermediate results. And so for introduction, it's not purely for RAG, but it's for general retrieval tasks. And as we know, LLMs generally struggle at challenging retrieval tasks. And here are 2 examples. The example on the left, it is known as the needle in a haystack retrieval, where we see that even state-of-the-art language models like Claude 2.1 struggle at this task. So it is a retrieval task, and as the context length becomes longer to the right, and the placed fact document depth becomes deeper in the documents, and generally Claude will lose track of the important information in the context, such that it fails to retrieve the information we want. And on the right, it is an improved version of needle in a haystack called multiple needle in a haystack. So basically, it is hiding multiple important information in a very long context. And we see that if we want GPT-4 to retrieve all of the important information hiding in the context, we see that as the needles, which are the important facts, becomes more, GPT-4 gradually loses track of the important information. So we know that LLMs generally struggle at these kind of retrieval tasks. And how do we make LLMs more capable of this kind of multi-fact retrieval? So we propose 4 different steps to tackle this problem. So first one is to explain what happens when LLM conducts multi-fact retrieval. And then based on our explanation, we're going to propose a method based on the observed phenomenon and try to improve LLM's retrieval specifically. And after we propose the method, we want to evaluate, does the proposed method improve LLM's multi-fact retrieval on the retrieval task? And lastly, we are going to try if the proposed method can generalize to other tasks. So let's begin with the first one. What happens when LLM conducts multi-fact retrieval? And here is the figure I showed previously. So a well-known phenomenon we know for LLMs doing this retrieval task is called lost in the middle for this kind of single fact retrieval. So basically what lost in the middle means is that when the key information is in the middle of a long context, the retrieval accuracy drops. So here, the dotted line can plot a region where the LLMs cannot retrieve the important information. So it's basically as the context length becomes longer and the document depth is in the middle of the sequence, the LLM will fail to extract the key information. And what about the situation in multi-fact retrieval? So in multi-fact retrieval task, a model needs to sequentially retrieve multiple key information scattered across a long context. So how does LLM perform in this challenge of multi-fact retrieval and multi-fact generation? So it means that the model needs to first identify the key information across the context. And secondly, it needs to output all of this information in sequence. So below, there's a figure here, shows the results of multi-query needle in a haystack, a task from Ruler, which is from this paper, what's the real context size of your long context language models. So this is a task of multi-fact retrieval where the model needs to retrieve based on different numbers of queries. So for example, if query equals 8, it means that the model needs to retrieve 8 different information from the context and answer them sequentially. So on the right, there is an example. And in the paper, they only tested E34 billion, which I think was one of the state-of-the-art models at that time. And as you can see, as the query becomes more and as the sequence length becomes longer, the model gradually drops the accuracy. So we want to know the reason behind the performance drop when we deal with multi-fact retrieval. So the phenomenon in the previous figure is that for E34 billion, the more queries to be retrieved, the lower the performance is. And why is that? The model just needs to output more retrieved information in the multi-query needle in a haystack task. So below, we propose 2 possible reasons behind this phenomenon. So the first one is that as the generation continues, the model gradually tends to output end of sequence rather than the key information. So it means that it doesn't tell, even it knows the key information. It knows where the information is. It knows what the correct information needs to retrieve, but it just tends to end earlier. And the second reason is that as the generation continues, the model loses track of the information to be retrieved. That is, the model just doesn't know the key information. As the generation continues, it loses track of the key information in the sequence. So it's very important to distinguish between these two possible reasons behind multi-fact retrieval, and it will help developing better retrieval strategies. So based on this motivation, we did a no versus tell experiment. So to distinguish between the no and tell reason in multi-query needle in a haystack, we conduct the following experiment. So the design is that we want to conduct an explainability experiment on the model's inner behavior. And the method we use is that we train a linear probe for each layer in an LLM to detect whether the model knows the ground truth key information in its hidden representations. We take this method from an existing paper called Insights into LLM Long Complex Failures when transformers know but don't tell. So they investigated the reason behind single fact retrieval, and we want to apply this technique into multi-fact retrieval. And the model we selected was Llama 3 8 billion instruct. And the data is we use a synthetic 50-query multi-query needle in a haystack dataset where each query and value is a single token. So this task is that we present a JSON file, where the JSON file is a series of key value pairs, and we give 50 different queries in the prompt, and we want the model to sequentially generate their corresponding value in the JSON file. And so the model needs to find 50 information and generate them in a sequence. And some more information about the linear probe. The linear probe for each layer maps an intermediate layer representation X, which corresponds to an output position of a value, into an output value token Y. So it's just to detect whether the intermediate representation of each token actually contains the information of the correct token Y. So we train each layer's linear probe by collecting these XY pairs on our generated dataset, where each instance contains 50 XY pairs corresponding to the 50 queries to be retrieved. And then let's see the results. So on the right, we show a figure, and the x-axis is the value token position index. So from 0 to 50, which correspond to the 50 different queries that we need to find their values. And the y-axis is the maximum probing accuracy across different layers, because we know that sometimes the model might have some specific information in some layers rather than the others. So we present the maximum probing accuracy. And from this figure, our findings are fivefold. So the first one is that the model can achieve 100% probing accuracy for the first 10 retrievals during generation, no matter what the key length is. And the second one is that as the generation continues along the x-axis, the maximum probing accuracy across layers, which is the y-axis, drops after the 10th query. And thirdly, we want to find a quantitative relationship between how many tokens the model can attend to versus the maximum probing accuracy. So we thought maybe if we change the length of the keys and the length of queries, the maximum probing accuracy might change. So we change the token length of each key, and we present the results in different curves. And it seems that when we use different key lengths, it doesn't change the deterioration points. They all deteriorate after the 10th query. But the model predicts the correct value less accurately, which is similar to our expectation. And fourthly, it is the conclusion of this experiment. The model fails at multi-query needle in a haystack because it doesn't know the correct answer, because the maximum probing accuracy will generally drops when as the generation continues. And lastly, we observe that there exists a different lost in the middle phenomenon, which we call lost in the middle phenomenon during generation. So we see that the 10th to 50th retrieved info gets lowest probing accuracy. And for the last one, the last retrieved information, it's the maximum probing accuracy increases compared to the previous ones. And after we observe what happens when LLM conducts multi-factor retrieval, we, based on this phenomenon, improves LLM retrieval specifically. So we propose a very simple method called FACT, find all crucial tags. So based on the lost in the middle in generation phenomenon, we know that the model cannot retrieve multiple information at once. For Llama 3.1, it can only retrieve 10 important informations. So our solution is very simple. We just break down the multi-fact retrieval into smaller and more frequent steps. So we just don't want the model to retrieve more than 10 information at once. So FACT is a simple multi-fact retrieval framework based on iterative rewriting. And on the right, it is the algorithm. And basically, it just conducts 3 different steps. So first one, it's when the model is given a query Q and a context C, we want the model to first retrieve key information from C. And then the second step is that we search the retrieved information from C and remove them. And thirdly, we continue this process until we reach a predefined number of iterations. And we make sure that in each iteration, the model doesn't retrieve more than a specific number of facts. So this simple process reduces the number of retrieved facts in each step and thus avoiding the lost in the middle region. And yeah, that's a very simple method. And let's test if the proposed method can improve LLM's multi-fact retrieval. And the experiment setting is like this. We first conduct experiments on purely retrieval task. We use 2 data sets. The first one is ruler, and the second one is counting stars. And we include examples of these 2 tasks below. So these 2 are just purely retrieval tasks without any reasoning. We just need the original fact hidden in the context. And we test on GPT-4o, GPT-4o mini, and Llama 3.18 billion instruct. We compare this simple iterative rewriting method against a naive baseline of directly prompting the LLM for the task to retrieve all the facts at once. And the results are like this. So there are 2 rows for each model. The first one is baseline, which is just retrieve everything. And the second one is fact. So as we can see, after applying our methods across all the different models and different tasks, we can achieve nearly 100% accuracy for these retrieval tasks, which shows the effectiveness of this simple iterative retrieval strategy. And we also altered the rewrite iterations for these models. And as we can see that as the rewrite iterations increase, the accuracy also increase across different models, and they can even reach 100% when the iterations reach 4. And lastly, we want to test if this simple method can generalize to other different tasks. So we test this method on a series of QA tasks. So the QA tasks are from Longbench, which is a long sequence evaluation suite containing a lot of different QA and summarization tasks. We selected 6 different tasks from 2 different categories: single document QA task and multi-document QA task. So for single document QA task, we selected narrative QA, Casper, and multi-field QA. And also for multi-document QA task, we selected Hotpot QA, 2WikiM QA, and Music. And we used the same 3 models, GPT-4o, GPT-4o mini, and Llama 3.18 billion instruct, as well as a new model, Q1 2.5 7B instruct. And the reason why it is a short paper instead of a long one is that the method doesn't perform well on these tasks. So as we can see, the 2 figures on the left are GPT-4o and GPT-4o mini, and they generally benefit from this method. And on the right, in contrast, the open source models doesn't perform well when after applying this method. So even after one single round of rewriting Llama 3.1 8 billion instruct suffers a lot in terms of performance. Here are some further analysis. So firstly, the effect of fact on different model families. So GPT-4o and 4o mini consistently improves as the number of rewriting increases. And Llama 3.1 and Q1 2.5 show a noticeable performance decline. And we think maybe because they lack training on retrieval requiring reasoning. Because according to some case study, we found that Llama and Q1 just cannot do the first round of retrieval correctly. And thus, it cannot do iterative rewriting based on this procedure. And secondly, the impact of fact varies significantly across tasks. So factual information QA benefits from facts, while multi-step reasoning and narrative tasks do not. And thirdly, the performance gain from direct retrieval methods like fact varies significantly between retrieval tasks and QA tasks, as shown in the previous section and this section, and thus calling for more thorough evaluation of similar frameworks, because we saw some papers only doing experiments on purely retrieval tasks without QA tasks, and we show this significant gap in this short paper to call for better evaluation. And the conclusion is as below. So the contribution of this work is that we use explainability tools to discover that model loses track of key information in multi-fact retrieval scenarios, resulting in a lost in the middle in generation phenomenon. And secondly, we propose fact, a simple iterative rewriting method for multi-fact retrieval. And we show that fact achieved nearly perfect results in two multi-fact retrieval tasks, suggesting its effectiveness in specific scenarios, just with less reasoning. And lastly, through a series of QA evaluation, we show that retrieval tasks are not enough for evaluating long context adaptation methods and calls for better long context reasoning frameworks. And this is like a technical report for work in progress. And now we are extending this framework into a more generalizable one. So we are applying agentic methods to the framework for tasks that require more reasoning capabilities. Instead of just retrieving the facts naively and just applying a simple rewriting method, we are applying more integrating more tools and more agentic procedures to the framework. And secondly, to discover task-specific dynamic rewriting techniques. So right now we apply the same set of prompts for the QA task, and maybe a task-specific prompt, for example, can benefit this task. And lastly, to explore more efficient chunk-by-chunk strategies to utilize LLMs with shorter context windows to make this method more generalizable to different types of models. Yeah, thank you so much. And that's all for my part. And I'll give the stage to Kyle.
Thank you, Suyuchen. If someone has a question, maybe we could ask Suyuchen right away.
Okay.
If not, we can wait until Kyle has presented his presentation. And it's really up to the audience if you have a pressing question for Suyuchen about his presentation. Otherwise, we can move on to Kyle. And then we're going to take the rest of the session to ask questions. Kyle, would you like to try and share your screen?
Okay, is this visible?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think what ties our two projects together, again, is this idea of when we do retrieval from a lot of context, when we need to retrieve multiple things from different parts of the context, it can require some specialized tuning or like pipeline strategies in order to solve these problems more effectively.
Kyle, you've muted yourself, unfortunately.
Oh, that's strange. It happened.
Okay, you can just restart from slide 2. That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, so my project focuses on procedural knowledge, which is different from factual knowledge, where a lot of QA tasks kind of focus a lot of their efforts. Factual knowledge is something like a statement about the world that can be either true or false, whereas procedural knowledge is knowledge how to accomplish a particular task. So like knowing how to crack eggs into the center of a pan takes more than just understanding, like doing world modeling at the level of making statements. It's more about understanding relationships between objects that are highly contextual, right? As we cook some food, for example, each step of a recipe has to do with the state of the world that we've produced by performing the previous steps in a recipe. So procedural knowledge is a lot more contextual, or can be a lot more contextual. But also it's important to note that procedural knowledge exists online in many different places as text. It's like in the human brain, we represent procedural knowledge very differently than we represent factual knowledge. Like, for example, I can't explain how I know how to ice skate, but I can do it. And so, but the fact is that these LLMs are trained on a lot of text that contains this sort of procedural knowledge represented as text. So the question that we want to solve is, can we leverage this procedural knowledge ability to explicitly build pipelines that can plan using LLMs? So for the purposes of this paper, we create a simple representation of procedural knowledge where we have an input string that represents any kind of starting state required for doing the procedure. And then we have an output string that represents the goal or the end state of the procedure. And then the steps are a list of strings which are required steps in order to accomplish the task. So this formalism introduces a bit of structure so that the procedure is represented in terms of its context and its goal, and then the steps to get there, which allows for composability because you can take two procedures where one maybe relies on the output of the other and then chain them together. But it's also flexible because it allows these terms to be defined in natural language. So in some cases, the input or the context can be a list of ingredients for a recipe, but in other cases, it can be a list of APIs that you need access to for a tutorial, or it can be just a description, a natural language description of the state that the world needs to be in order to accomplish a procedure. So in the future, we will extend this with explicit representations between of the dependencies between each of these steps, but we wanted to keep it simple for this project. And here, the task of procedure generation is to predict the list of steps given the input and the output. So for example, if we're working with recipes, if the task is to make a sesame crusted tuna with wasabi sauce, we want to be able to generate a recipe for this given a certain set of ingredients. And here our goal is to create an effective procedural memory so that just like when humans cook, if we were trying to create a new recipe, we can adapt our knowledge from previous recipes. So just in this way, we want to create a system that can, based on a store of procedural knowledge, we can sort of draw analogies from past knowledge. Like in this example, we retrieve a related recipe that makes coriander encrusted lemongrass tuna. And then we can sort of use our reasoning skills to adapt one or more of these examples to solving the current task. And so in this in this paper, we designed a system that implements this sort of procedural memory based on this representation that I showed. And then we use it to solve new tasks that the system hasn't seen before, tasks that aren't necessarily in the procedural memory. So, and one key point here I want to stress is that this allows us to use a frozen LLM because it's always possible to train, like say if we have a bunch of recipes, it's always possible to train an LLM on more of these recipes and then use it to solve more tasks. But in the case of one of our data sets, we tried to create a data set that the LLM was not aware of at all. And the goal of our system was to create something that could, based on procedural memory, or based on procedural skills in this new domain the LLM is not familiar with, we can still produce useful procedural answers or useful lists of steps in order to accomplish these tasks, even though the frozen language model has no familiarity with the domain. So the system that we developed, we call it analogy augmented generation, sort of in a play off of the term retrieval augmented generation. And it uses some components that are already probably very familiar to those who study RAG. So up here, given the question, including the input, the context, so the input and the output from the procedural representation, we first generate a candidate procedure using just RAG. So we retrieve K procedures from the procedural memory using just cosine similarity. And then we put those into the prompt and have the model produce a candidate procedure. And then we update that using information that we retrieve in order to answer specific questions that the LLM thinks are relevant to this task. So if we go back to the example with making sesame crusted tuna, the analogical example here with the coriander encrusted lemongrass tuna, the similarity here is the tuna, right? So I think from this example recipe, we can learn something about how cooking with tuna works in general. And so the goal here is to use query rewriting, which is something that has already been published about. We generate some queries, basically some subqueries that the LLM thinks will be useful in solving the overall goal. And then we use each of those queries to retrieve K procedures from the procedural memory, and then we summarize them. We use those procedures to create summaries of the answer to those questions, and then we update the RAG candidate using those summaries. So the idea here would be that if we've retrieved multiple different recipes that involve, say, wasabi sauce or sesame seeds or tuna, then we can sort of combine our knowledge about these different components in order to make a recipe that actually works out for this this novel recipe. And then we use a common concept called self-critique, where the language model is asked to criticize its own answer. And then we go through several cycles of revision where the language model is given access to the summaries at every step, the summaries from the analogical component of this pipeline, so that it can always revise its answers before producing the final output answer. So we test this method on 3 different domains. One is recipes. A second is Python tutorials specific to the package, the LangChain Python package. And then third is competition math problems. And so for each of these data sets, we take the training set and we use that as the procedural memory. And then our goal is to generate steps given the input and the output. And we do an LLM-based evaluation on the output. So the way that the LLM-based evaluation works is that we do a pairwise evaluation between the generated procedures from 2 methods at a time. And we evaluate on a few metrics, which I list here, about the quality of the procedure. We do this evaluation multiple times, rotating the position so that there's no position bias in the evaluation. And then with recipes, we do a human evaluation to back up the results of the LLM-based evaluation. And I'll explain why we only did it with recipe NLG. I'll explain that in a minute. So to give more detail on the recipe data set, we use recipe NLG, which is a bunch of recipes scraped from the internet, and we make the input or the context be the list of ingredients for the recipe, and then the output is the name of the recipe, and then the steps are the steps of the recipe, which is pretty clear. And then one of our contributions in this work is LC step, which is a new data set that we've created ourselves, which we represent as procedures by, I guess I'll back up. What we did was we took from the LangChain website all of the tutorials that explain how to use the package, and we created a pipeline that had humans in the loop for taking these tutorials and compressing them into step-by-step instructions. And then this is how we created the set of procedures that are part of this data set. So we collected 276 procedures from the LangChain Python documentation using GPT-4. And the key here is that for when we do the experiments, we use a version of GPT 3.5 that has a cutoff date before the public release of LangChain. And the point of this is that we'd like to measure whether our system can use a frozen language model that's unfamiliar with the domain to generate procedures in that new domain, given only the extra help that comes from having procedural memories related to the domain. So here is the pipeline that we use to collect the LC step data. Just briefly, we scrape the documents from LangChain, and then we decided which documents were more conceptual versus which ones were more focused on tutorials. And then we used GPT-4 to extract a step-by-step list of instructions. And then we had a human-in-the-loop evaluation step where GPT-4 and humans looked at the generated procedures to make sure that they made sense. And then that's what resulted in the procedures that are part of this data set. So our final data set was CHAMP, which is a math problem data set with step-by-step solutions. And the reason that we chose this data set is specifically because we can use those step-by-step solutions as steps. And then we take, as a final step, we put that the answer is, and then what the answer is, so that we can use our same system to approach this problem, which usually isn't, like, math problems aren't usually seen as procedural knowledge, but we represent the math problems in this way as sort of a way to stretch the representation and see how well our system does on this task. And then for comparison, we compare our AAG system with zero-shot prompting, with few-shot prompting, RAG, and then React. We set up React with a tool that uses the same retrieval system as AAG and RAG as a search tool, and it has multiple chances to retrieve before deciding to produce an output. So these are the results, and again, we're using a pairwise evaluation performed by GPT 3.5 to decide which of the produced procedures are better. And here in each of these graphs, we compare AAG with one of the baselines. So here, this is for recipe NLG, and for zero-shot, few-shot, and RAG, we find that the evaluation claims that AAG is much better than these baselines. And a thing to note here is that we don't include the React results, but React always performed much worse than RAG in our experiments, which was, so we don't include it here in the results. But you can see here that for recipe NLG and LC step, it's pretty obvious that the AAG results are preferred. And for CHAMP, it's a little bit more mixed. And we think that the CHAMP is sort of a bit of a stretch for our formalism and for our application. So, but it was still an interesting thing to try. And then for recipes, we ran a human evaluation. So we compared here just AAG versus RAG, and we had humans evaluate 50 generated recipes, and the human results back up the LLM-based evaluation results in saying that AAG is preferred over RAG. And So here's just an example with LC step. So for the task of setting up a custom input schema for a tool with validation logic, the reference set of steps is here on the left, and you can see that we made sure to include in the steps all of the APIs, all of the LangChain APIs that are called. And then here are the results using RAG versus the results using AAG. And here, if you spend some time looking at this, you can see how difficult it would be, even as someone who's, I guess, a RAG practitioner myself. It's not very obvious how I, as a human, would evaluate this this generation, even if I am very familiar with LangChain. And so we decided to do the human evaluation just on recipe NLG because we found it really difficult, even for ourselves, to evaluate this this result. And we need to spend some more time in another work really thinking hard about how to run these evaluations in a way that verifies the quality, I think. Here we run some ablations where we remove the query rewriting component, the summarization component, as well as the self-critique component. And in general, we find that the full system is preferred by the pairwise evaluation over all of these ablation versions. Although results, again, are slightly mixed for CHAMP. So in this work, we create a simple theoretical framework for operating on procedural knowledge. We create a novel LLM pipeline with retrieval over a custom procedure memory store that leverages this framework for procedural knowledge. And we show increased performance over RAG and React, especially on an unseen topic, which is especially interesting, I think. And we back this up with a human study in the case of recipes. So going forward, we'd like to take our procedure representation here and complexify it. So we're doing work right now to make it into a graph representation where we have nodes are steps which are labeled as APIs or categories of actions, and then they have details to them. And then the relationships between the nodes, the edges, are strings representing the inputs and outputs between each step. And the benefits of this is that we can explicitly represent the dependencies between each step. We can represent cycles and decision branches. Also, we can retrieve from subgraphs. So if we need to think about just like if we're doing something with baking, for example, with cooking, often the preheat step is first, but it's only the final baking step that depends on this preheating step. And so if we're able to break these procedures into graphs, we can cut subgraphs and then search over just these subgraphs in order to find relevant components that could be more specific and have less noise in order to answer particular questions in the query rewriting component. And then reasons that we're finding this difficult right now are it's very difficult to ensure that we extract correct graphs from text data. We had trouble making sure that we could extract just the list of steps, but ensuring that the dependencies are represented correctly is quite difficult. So we're working on an approach to that. And we also, I think it's an open problem to measure the accuracy of generated graphs given a reference graph. So these are some difficulties that we're looking at right now. That covers it for this project. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Very interesting. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, so don't hesitate to raise your hand to ask questions to Suyuchen or Kyle. I think I'm going to start with one quick question, Kyle, for you. You presented 3 tasks for recipe, for Llama Index, and for math problems. What kind of adaptations to your pipeline do you do for each task? Is it simply the case that you just swap the data, or are there changes within the pipeline?
Sure. We tried to keep it very general with the prompts and also with the retrieval. So the only thing that changes between the tasks is when we encode the procedures, in a vector representation for the vector store. We have to represent them as text in order to pass them to an encoder, and we use just a very popular text embedding model, which it's all MPNet base v2. So for that, we convert the representations slightly differently for each. So for recipes, we say, recipe colon and then the title, and then we list the ingredients, and then we list the steps. Whereas for the LC step data set, we do it slightly differently just to make the representation look more natural for the domain. So that's one adaptation. And then in the prompts within the method itself, we just refer to things differently. We'll say recipe, or we'll say tutorial, or we'll say math solution, something like that.
Okay. So basically, if you want to adapt it to a fourth task, for instance, you'd have to simply provide a few keywords and provide some sort of scheme to represent a given procedure.
Mm-hmm. And so for the next step of this work, this ongoing work, where we're doing graphs instead, we want to create an embedding of the graph itself that sort of captures this structure, right? And it is that will allow it to do representations of subgraphs and things like that. So that will get a little bit more complex, but I think it will also get a little bit more general. So we'll stop needing the text representation of the procedures as a whole. Yeah.
I see. Thank you. Whenever there are math problems, I'm always curious, is there a special way to tokenize or represent these equations, or do you simply just consider them as white space separated words?
Yeah, that's a good question. We just use the text from the dataset as is and expect the LLM to have a good tokenization. So we're using GPT 3.5 for these experiments, and so we just use the default tokenization.
Okay, so a token like 31 is a single token, and 32 is a different token.
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't have any special doesn't have any special math representations. Okay.
So the keyword today is representation with the word of Parishad and yourself. It's key. Are there any other question? You can raise your hand.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question about the retrieval step. So you have to retrieve the similar examples and try to do some critiques about that. And have you observed that by formulating different queries, you will get different results? This is related to Parishad talk. So she talked about the two components, retrieval and then the following reasoning step. So here, if you change the way to retrieve similar examples, that could impact your final results. The example of tuna, you said that the tuna is the most important, but how do you identify that the tuna is the most important and not the sesame or other stuff?
Yeah, so so coming back here, where this happens is within the query rewriting component. And I should have included an example here of what some of the queries are, but they tend to look like search queries that one might put in when trying to learn about cooking generally. So in this case, like with the tuna example, it might ask a question about baking with tuna. So how do I bake with tuna? Or it might ask a question of how do I add do I add sesame before or after baking? So the LLM is the one deciding what questions to ask, and then the retrieved procedures are hopefully relevant to that particular question. So there's based on Parishad's work, there's definitely more to be done, because what we currently hope is that the representations work well for this sort of natural language question answering, but adapted to procedures, which I don't think that we have evidence necessarily that it's doing what we hope it is doing. Besides just these very downstream results that seem to be showing that our system works better. So I would like to investigate that for sure.
Good.
We have a question from Samira in the chat, who is now forced to write because she's muted. So Samira asks, for Kyle, did anyone use LaTeX representation for math equations?
So I believe in the data set, I couldn't prove this to you right now, but I believe in the data set, the representations are with LaTeX. They're not with Unicode. Like a summation symbol, I think is with a \sum rather than like a summation symbol.
Yeah, that's a good idea. On the slide that's currently displayed, Kyle, could you tell us a little more about LLM Critic? What kind of introspection does it carry out?
Yeah, so self-critique is sort of this fraught thing within the literature, because there are some papers that suggest that it's really doing something useful if it's able to go back multiple times, and others suggest that any sort of refinement or correction that it does is just as likely to correct it to be wrong rather than to correct it correctly. But we did find in our situation that it helped. So just briefly, the prompt for this component looks something like we present the candidate response given like the recipe we're trying to produce and the ingredients and the steps that are a part of the candidate so far. And then we say, given these summaries of question and answer pairs from this previous component, can you notice any problems with the candidate as it stands right now? And then it lists problems, and then a separate prompt incorporates those suggestions to modify the candidate.
Okay, so it's an open-ended question where you ask what's wrong with your answer.
Yeah, it's not framed as here's your answer. It's here's someone else's answer, but functionally we're using it the same way. Yeah,
I see. For the evaluation part, you explained a little about this, but it's I mean, there's a lot of automated steps there. You use LLM to evaluate itself, which is pretty straightforward. But in that case, there's this possibility that one recipe may very well be better than the other one, but neither is appropriate.
You mean, oh, I see, right. Both recipes would be bad if you actually made them, but yeah. One is, I guess, closer in like fuzzy terms.
Yes, yeah. Because there's a lot of, you have to look at the outputs at some point, and you did. Mm-hmm. You presented a human evaluation to corroborate the results, but there's really the risk here for complex procedures to be all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And there were a few examples that I looked at myself because I did I was a part of the human evaluation as well, where neither was very good. And I picked between the two, but I wouldn't have cooked that recipe myself. Yeah, so I think that the graph in the future, when we figured out how to, let's assume that we have a correct graph for the original recipe that represents sort of the relations between the steps. I think that there will be a structural component that we can evaluate sort of objectively if we have this ground truth, because if it doesn't have a preheat step, or if it doesn't have, like, let's say, I guess more basically, if it doesn't have a bake step, then it's not going to be edible. And so there's it's sort of like provably wrong. If the original recipe has a bake step and it includes, if there's some structure around that, then we can develop an evaluation that's more likely to capture that problem.
Yes, it's a problem in itself, the evaluation of such systems.
Yeah, exactly. I think our next work will really focus on that.
Thank you so much. So there's just one last question. I think Samira finds your presentation quite impressive, Kyle, and she wants to know which tool you use to create it.
Oh, it's called Reveal.js. It's you write your presentation in Markdown, and then you can add HTML to do some animation.
Thank you. And with that, if there are no further questions, I think we're going to conclude. So I think we had really an interesting a triple of presentations. We are going to, of course, record and publish the presentation that we've had today. It's going to be available on our website shortly. And I'm going to invite the presenters to send me a PDF of their slides so that we can also present them. It's really up to you. I think I'm going to thank you everyone for attending this CLIQ-ai meeting. I want to thank Professor Ni, who's the PI for this consortium, and my colleagues Vanessa and Mariam for organizing everything. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so we will try to organize some in-person meeting for next year. Yeah, thank you again.